Hello. Today joining me is Desmond West. He is a senior systems engineer and has ample experience working around office moves, namely in New York City. And so we're going to talk about some key factors to really consider when you're planning an office move, and also just some of his experiences, good and bad, about how to be prepared for what exactly is going to happen when an office move occurs. So Desmond, thank you so much for joining. I appreciate it. I guess right off the top of the bat, if a client was coming up to you and said, "Hey, we're planning an office move. It's going to happen," what would be the first question that comes to your mind to at least get yourself started or get them started on the right foot?
The first questions would be, do you know where the space is and when can we get in that space to take a look at the infrastructure, at what's already there, what's missing? Do they already have network runs? Is there already an internet provider that's able to go into that building and has already historically done internet provisions in that building? So primarily, I'd love to see how quickly we could get into that new space.
Excellent. And I'm assuming then also that some of the questions you might need would be about, the building restrictions themselves. Are there folks that are required to do the work if work is necessary? Are there different restrictions on what you can and cannot do inside the building, and things of that nature, I assume as well?
Yeah, so subsequently, once we've gotten into the space and we've done an initial survey, allowing us to know where wireless access points will need to be, where the network closet and server equipment will go. Once we've gotten an inventory of all that stuff, then we'll go and try to figure out with the building, okay, how early or how late can people be in the space doing work? Do they have a union that's contracted or internal building workers who do wiring and have to do power or whatever adjustments are necessary. And once we get those answers, it allows for us to then make a determination about time and how long things will take and expectations in that regard.
One of the more basic things but also unfortunately complicated depending on the timing of the move, is working with connectivity. If let's say you're on Time Warner, building doesn't support Time Warner. There's maybe it's someone else. What are some of the, I guess, what's the best scenario time frame to work with to start planning on and working with vendors like for connectivity in your experience?
So most vendors say that with a new build, uh, if they can get 60 days out,
Hmm.
that would be ideal because many of them say 45 days in order to do this or that.
Mm.
Um, in the best circumstances, if we get 3 months out, depending on the type of deployment that's happening, that would be even better. Obviously, the more time, the better, but 60 days would be ideal, unless other things, aside from other factors. Um, so typically, especially in the New York area, there's at least one vendor that's in a building that we can at least get connectivity through so that when the client makes the move, they're able to get in and keep using their service. The caveat and the difficulty that often arises is that sometimes clients have a contract with a particular vendor for connectivity. And there are times where that vendor is not able to provide that service in the new location that they're going to. Thankfully, the vast majority of the different providers these days allow for month to month and don't even do contracts anymore, whether it's Time Warner or what they're called now is Spectrum, or you could do so with Verizon or other providers, Pilot, and so forth. If you choose such a vendor and they're available in the building, then it's great to move over. But if the vendor that you have and you're on contract with is not in the new building, then you're either going to have to pay the termination fee, or sometimes they'll work with you and will piggyback on another provider that's available in your new building, and you'll still have to pay them and potentially renew the contract. So connectivity is really one of those things where you just need to, as early as possible, get all the details about what's available in the new space so that you can make a determination as to what you want to do.
Excellent. And so, just so I understand too, you were kind of alluding that there's always some vendor in the building, right? So, let's say worst case scenario, it's not enough time. There, it seems that if push comes to shove, you have to be in the office at this point, this day, and it's too early. But you do need some sort of connectivity. You usually have seen that folks can jump over to the other. What are some of the negatives of doing that? Although,
Um, I can't really think of any major negatives.
okay,
So it tends to be that in the vast spaces in New York, there's a cable internet provider
sure.
who will be available. I won't even mention DSL, primarily because speed-wise, it's just not ideal for a large business. So oftentimes that can be used for phone service, but not for just internet browsing regularly. So cable vendors typically, in our experience, if they're already in a building, can get their service up and running in a new client site in under 2 weeks. So they're the best for a quick deployment. Whereas sometimes if you're trying to get a fiber vendor, there might be a significant period of time that you have to wait. Sometimes, primarily, they're the ones who often take 45 days or more because of different restrictions and things they have to go through in order to be able to get the service to the client.
Would that be a good opportunity to kind of get ahead of the game and consider having a second uh, ISP in order for backup and things of that nature? Would that kind of be a leg up to get that? If you're like, okay, well, I know that this vendor is in the building, I'll get some sort of temporary contract there just to get the connectivity. But then at the same time, I do want fiber, so I have some wiggle room now. I can, wait for that to come in, but I'll just stay connected here until then.
Yeah, the fact that the vast majority of companies now rely on internet in some way, shape, or form, it's really critical to have a failover connection anyway. So when we're doing that initial look at the new space, we're going to look at the multiple vendors available. Cable is going to oftentimes have a really fast download speed, but upload speeds will often be slower. In fact, in almost every case, cable's upload speed is slower. And so when you're able to get a fiber connection, you'll be able to do uploads faster, downloads faster. So oftentimes what ends up happening is if both are available, we'll get the cable connection in because boom, we know that's going to be available and we'll be able to do that quickly and get that configured and so forth. And then we'll start to look at the fiber providers. Some fiber providers give really awesome plans where they'll say, hey, if your service is down for a certain period, we're going to refund you back a lot of money, or like 20% for every hour it's down, or things like that, because fiber is so stable. And so we then, once the cable internet's up, then we'll look at the different fiber providers and see who's available in the space. And based on which ones, in our experience, have the best customer service and also the best policies in terms of what they'll return to customers if there's any downtime, then we'll go with trying to get that deployed secondarily. And if it takes 45 days or 60 days for that other connection to be in, that's fine because then you have a fiber connection that you can utilize perpetually subsequent to that. So it's worth doing it that way.
Excellent. So another thing that came to mind while you were talking about that is like, okay, I've got connectivity set up. I'm ready to roll with that, but I could. In some of our experiences, business owners, they get a little overwhelmed because it is it's a, or, office managers, whoever is in charge about the operation staff of performing this office move. There's so much to think about, and IT sort of takes that second step, or a little bit pushed to the side, just thinking about, there's the physical equipment that has to be moved, there's people. What are some of the things that you like to address with whoever's in charge of the move to really consider in advance, whether it's thinking about the future, if there's more people, if there's growth planned for, if there's even back, people are scaling back, things of that nature?
So there are a few things that come immediately to mind that oftentimes are overlooked on the client side. So because the client is moving into a new space, it has to be considered what downtime is acceptable for the move. So if zero downtime is acceptable, then that means either they need to purchase all new hardware so that the new space can be pre-filled, or they need to be comfortable only having part of their infrastructure working in the old space so that we could take some of their equipment over to the new space. And then when they get into the new space, they'll only have half the space until we put in the rest of the equipment. So things like that have to be considered. Some clients, they'll go into the new space like, why isn't everything working? Well, we have to take things from the old space. So those kind of things need to be considered. How much downtime is allowable? How much of the space needs to be 100% up and running? What is the expectation on the last working day? Is there an expectation that the team members are going to work their full hours on the last working day before the move? Is the move going to happen midweek and they're expected to be fully up and running the next day? These are things that just need to be discussed, and reasonable expectations need to be set so that the client isn't frustrated. And then also another thing that needs to be considered is, one, when a client moves to a new space, if they have IP addresses that are static IP addresses, namely things that IPs that would go to maybe their VPN connection or other things like that, those things are going to need to be adjusted. And so we need to make sure that the users are going to be aware of whatever new methods or adjustments need to be made in getting to the different resources that they have. Because in almost 100% of the cases, when someone moves to a different location, they're not able to keep the same static IP. They get a new set of static IPs, and they need to be configured accordingly. So those are the kind of things that, just as the IT team, we need to be able to think about beforehand so that they're aware and the client doesn't feel frustrated that they weren't notified or that certain expectations weren't met that they maybe had but weren't reasonable.
Hmm. What about planning for error, mistakes? Things get dropped. Unfortunately, things break. What are some of the best tactics in your mind for preparing or either planning for that to happen? Things to go wrong.
I mean, there's two things I would say to that. Always make sure that you have, as it pertains to moving, particularly network equipment, or not network equipment, but just electronics equipment, whether it's your Macs, your iMacs, your servers, or so forth. There are two options there. The first option is always get a moving company that is confident in their ability to move electronics and high-level electronics, expensive electronics. Make sure that they have sufficient insurance to do that. Because if you have a company that is capable in doing that stuff, then that's less of a worry on your end. If you're doing the moving of that equipment yourself, you're putting yourself in a predicament. So it's worthwhile to just consider which moving companies are available in the area and who are known for doing the best job in moving this type of equipment. The other thing that we often do is, depending on the nature of the equipment, sometimes maybe they have a server that has RAID drives, and so on and so forth. And perhaps we'll take those ourselves because we are familiar with them, we know what to do, and it's only maybe one piece of equipment, but it's really important, and we will take the utmost care with it. And then we'll move it over to the new space. And then perhaps we'll also move network equipment, because oftentimes the networking equipment is really light, it's easy to move, and it's pretty robust so that if you drop it, it's not a major issue, but we take care of that stuff. So we'll be able to get the critical infrastructure over to the new space and get that pre-configured. But as for the client workstations and so forth, it's incredibly important to have a capable moving company do that stuff.
Hi there. I hope you're enjoying the show. We'd love to get to know you. We help creative companies get work done by delivering a simple, strategic, and human IT experience. If you'd like to talk to one of us, go to ripplit.com/sign-me-up. We'd love to get to know you more. Thank you, and back to the show.
Great. What in terms of the actual the aesthetics of an office move? I know you and I together have been in circumstances where it's either the wiring needs to be completely redone, and that's going to change the appearance of the office, quite frankly, because it could be a very open office, and there might not be anywhere to conceal the wires. What are some of your thoughts on what to do when you're realizing it might be a little bit of a challenge for the AV folks to run wires? What are some of the things to overcome that so that aesthetically it looks nice?
Oh, there's two things that come to mind immediately. The first thing is, when you're moving into a new space, if there needs to be walls put up, if walls need to be covered or any of those things, let's get the wiring company in there immediately, because the more access that they have to the underbelly, so to speak, they're able to get things hidden as cleanly as possible. If that's not the case and the space is already configured in a particular way, then sometimes there are some neat ways that professional wiring companies are able to get around it. So they may run trays up high and have the wires run along those trays, which looks pretty neat and clean, and they can get those done. Or there are certain cases where they may be able to get things into the walls, even if the walls have already been put up. But ultimately, really, when it comes to an office move, the underlying theme in all of this is, as soon as you're confident in where you're going, or you're even determining where you should go, and you need maybe a little guidance as to whether it's a practical place, bring in the IT team. We'll be able to go over there and say, hey, you're not going to be able to have the provider you already have, and so you're going to have to get rid of this connection, and you're going to have to pay a particular fee. If you have another option as to location to go to, maybe let's look at that one. Or maybe there are other things that just allow for us to know beforehand, and maybe get in a wiring vendor to do a survey of the area. Then we can at least get all that information out to you so that you can make as educated of determination as possible. Otherwise, once the walls go up, once it's a week away, you got to take what you can get. And that's not the ideal circumstance. And that's not how we want our clients to have to deal with things, especially in a space that they're hopefully going to stay in for 3, 4, 5, 10 years.
Have you ever encountered a situation where they're like, we really don't want any wires, we just want it to be almost entirely wireless? Have you ever experienced that, or how would you overcome that, or even recommend it?
Wireless has come a long way from the 802.11b Linksys routers that we used to have, and you could connect 3 people before it's terrible. But in every circumstance, it's still ideal to have physical connectivity where possible. If you have an office where everyone's connected via wireless, just the nature of wireless, there are going to be potentially some hiccups. We'll do the best that we can. We'll get the best possible equipment so that we can make things work if a client is really stark about not having any wires. But it's just the best case scenario is to have some wiring, whether it's hidden up to a point and then it's run along the sides of maybe the cubicles or whatever other methods they use. They're very neat ways to hide wires, but wires are just a solid solution for a lot of the different needs that clients have, especially when they want to have high-speed access to servers, where maybe they want to use 10 gigabit Ethernet, where maybe they do a lot of video or other high intense video or graphics type work, where having that higher bandwidth would be ideal for them. It just makes the most sense to at least plan for the future, such that you do have the ability to use cables in any scenario that's needed. But I don't think we've ever been unable to convince a client that some cables are useful. There may be certain spaces where they're like, okay, maybe this is client facing and we don't want them to see wires. We have some clients like that, and that's fine. Maybe in a particular conference room or maybe in a certain area that's client facing, they want it to be as neat and pretty as possible. We're good with that. But then in the work areas where people need to get as much productivity as they can, we really push to have those wires neat and tidy, but available to all those who are going to use it.
Right. Especially if you're in a larger building. I mean, in New York City in particular, or Atlanta. I mean, if you're in a highly congested area, you're competing with a lot of different organizations in a very small, concentrated area.
Yeah, we've had clients who bought wireless access points 3 years ago, but they become obsolete because now their same wireless spectrum is being saturated by a ton of other companies because New York and Atlanta are just very congested in terms of people in a lot of buildings and buildings close to each other. And so then now you're in a situation where you have to lay out more money because you need to get a newer set of wireless access points so that your team can be productive again. Otherwise, people are getting kicked off or all these different other issues. And so that's just something that's going to happen and something that just needs to be considered. Even if you have the newest, best wireless capabilities, as those wireless spectrums get saturated by tons of other people utilizing even their hotspots and hotels nearby and all these other things, it just becomes imperative that you always have the fail-safe of using the network cable. And it allows for you to have flexibility in how frequently you upgrade your wireless infrastructure.
I like that. So design around a way to say, look, when push comes to shove, you'll have something that's connected, that's wired in. That if you really, if you want to do something fairly robust, that option is there, but you can still create the environment that allows for flexibility to move around, have your, powwows on your beanbag chairs, things of that nature. It seems like that there two focal points for an office move is to think about what do you want the staff experience to be in terms of how they're using their machines, and then how do you want to present yourself and your team to prospective clients. So it might be conference room technology. Do you, and things to consider in advance, right? Like, if you're a very presentation heavy organization, you're going to probably want to make sure that room is equipped to deliver on that. If you're also an open space atmosphere, right, at an organization, my guess is you're going to want to, yes, follow your thoughts on making sure that, there's the capability to connect directly, but also think about what kind of space what type of systems do you need in place to ensure that people can just bring their laptop with them and continue the conversation.
Yeah. I mean, so yes, Wi-Fi is ubiquitous, should be everywhere. And that's an expectation that clients really should have because people bring their own devices, phones, laptops, and so forth. But wherever there's a stationary device, whether it's a server, whether it's a desktop, whether it's a printer or so forth, you're going to need to ideally, especially if they're used frequently, have some sort of physical connectivity. And why not also have that physical connectivity available to those who want it? Especially if, say, there's a situation where they need the additional speed of being able to plug in. All right, I know that now there are a lot of improvements in Wi-Fi that makes it faster and at times can make it even just as fast as gigabit Ethernet. But in practical usage and in most cases, unless you're sitting right under a wireless access point, you're probably not going to get those speeds. And maybe even then. So getting those physical cables, getting them plugged in and set up, being prepared to have that availability to your team is only going to be to the benefit of a company.
Okay. One last question that I think surprised me the first time I experienced was, let's say you're an organization, 90% of what you do is in the cloud already. So in your mind, when you're designing this new office, I don't have a server, so therefore I don't need an IT closet. How would you answer that, and how would you respond in order to prepare for what you might actually need an IT closet, but here's what you should expect to have in that room?
Yeah. So there's a reason why it's called an IT closet these days. And rarely is it specifically referred to as a server closet or just a network closet. It's because a lot of things are going to go in there. And so that's where the lines for your internet connections will typically end up. That's where your network equipment is going to be. And oftentimes that may be where your security vendor puts their equipment too. So the camera, NVR, and the other necessary equipment, a lot of it will go in there. So unless it just isn't sensible to not have a separate place for that. And it's really a security hazard too, if a lot of that stuff is just anywhere.
Mm.
A lot of people are getting more and more savvy as it pertains to technology. And even if your infrastructure is in the cloud, you're going to need infrastructure locally that allows you to get there. So you need to make sure that physically that stuff is separate, it's partitioned, it's in a place that is secure. That way everything can run smoothly. That way also too, even if it's not strictly about security, you aren't going to accidentally have people going in, unplugging the wrong thing, making mistakes and causing hazards that'll affect the whole company. Instead, you'll have a space that's ideal, configured, and the IT team knows exactly where everything is, how everything should be, and things can stay running smoothly. And when there's an issue, if there's a hiccup, the IT team can come in confidently knowing that it wasn't messed around with by somebody who shouldn't have had access.
Excellent. I think that's really useful to think of, because I think if you're not someone who has servers, it can very easily get forgotten about, that to even think that you need a room or a space to contain all that.
Yeah, and the spaces don't have to be as large as maybe they once did, or may not need to have the same kind of super high level cooling that they did before and so forth, when you maybe have a bunch of servers running locally. But they still need to be reasonably cool. They still need to be of reasonable size. They can be a relatively small room these days, but something separate and secure would be ideal.
Excellent. So as a close, anything that we didn't bring up that you always, that is definitely top of mind in terms of an office move that we haven't covered?
I would say that the clients, our partners, just aside from trying to recognize that we want to know things as early in advance as possible, I think also too, it needs to be understood that there may be a hiccup or two. Something might happen. Some issues may occur the first time people get into the new space. There may be different hiccups because when you're leaving one space into a totally different space, and especially if the IT vendor that you're using wasn't with you during your previous office move, there may be things that the previous IT vendor did that just require some tweaks. And so for both the partners and the IT vendor, it's reasonable to have somebody on site on that go live, that first go live day where everyone's there. That way somebody competent is available. If something's not working right or if there's some issue, we can quickly go in and identify the problem and get it set. So I don't think that any office move is benefited by not having an IT team member on site, available, ready to assist people on the day of go live.
Excellent. That's great advice. Desmond, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And this is great. I think this will help out a lot of folks if they're in the process of thinking about shifting offices, moving, going somewhere else, or even doing a complete renovation. All of this is completely relevant to that. So thank you so much for your time.
No problem. Anytime.